I would like to welcome you this evening to our inaugural Gordon Smith lecture series. And as is tradition at the University of Victoria, I first would like to acknowledge that tonight's event takes place on the traditional territory of the Coast and Strait Salish people. My name is Oliver Schmidtke, and I'm the current director of the Center for Global Studies, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our two speakers for tonight, Dr. Gordon Smith, who can join us today, and the Honourable Paul Martin, Canada's former Prime Minister, and they're going to take the show very soon. But let me set the agenda for tonight, and those of you who might not be familiar with Dr. Gordon Smith, tell you very briefly about the legacy that he left behind, being the director of the Centre from 98 all the way to 2012. Dr. Smith arrived at the University of Victoria in 1997 after a very distinguished career with the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, which included postings such as being the ambassador to the Canadian delegation to NATO in the late 1980s, the ambassador to the European Union in Brussels in the early 1990s, and then from 94 to 97, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. In 2009, Dr. Smith was awarded the Vanier Medal for Public Services to Canada. And next to his prominent career with the Government of Canada, he's also an accomplished scholar, holding a PhD from MIT in political science and having authored many books on various issues pertaining to global governments and global security. And building on his outstanding achievement as a public servant, foreign policy expert, and scholar, Dr. Smith took over the role to establish the Center for Global Studies back in 1998, which he served then for 14 years. And under his directorship, the Center became an influential hub for works on critical issues in international politics. For instance, institutes with a focus on women's rights, international women's rights, climate change, international children's rights were established at the Center and developed great impact in their respected policy domains. And most importantly, through Dr. Smith's close involvement organizing and conducting research on the G7, G8, and G20 summits and the transformation of the UN, he really put UVic onto the international map, gave UVic a kind of international reputation that was very rewarding for the research that is being done here in Victoria. And, having come into this position relatively recently, I gradually become familiar with the scope and the quality of the network that Dr. Smith has been able to establish. When I get the odd phone call from people trying to talk to Dr. Smith and they have to tell him that unfortunately he has to resign or he's no longer here, I realized, how far-reaching and all over the globe this network has been built and was very fruitful in linking UVic to different policy communities and scholars from around the world. Now, I would like to ask someone to the stage who can speak with far greater authority to the legacy left behind by Dr. Smith, namely Barry Caron, who has been the co-director of the Center and also the director of the Globalization and Governments Program at UVic. Barry Caron himself comes with a distinguished career in the federal service. In his later stage, he was the Deputy Minister in the Ministry of State for Social Development and worked as a senior advisor with the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources and with the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs. He also co-wrote what I found a book together with Dr. Smith in 2010 entitled Reinventing CEDAW for the Canadian Defence and Foreign Affairs, and I guess reading it today again would shed an interesting light on the current change in foreign policy in Canada, but that's a different issue. We don't want to go there, but I'm really delighted that he will share some reflections on the legacy left behind by Dr. Smith over the period of the last 14 years. Before I hand it over to Barry Caron, let me just point out that this event will be photographed and filmed, so if you feel uncomfortable with being maybe on one of these shots, please let the photographer know. Barry, could I invite you to the stage?
Well, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. But there's always a tension when you have people like Mr. Smith and Mr. Martin to work with. Mr. Martin insists on a 1 hour or 2 hour or even ideally a 3 hour briefing on any particular topic, and Gordon likes it in 30 seconds. I'd just like to say a few things about Gordon's character, which people may not really be very familiar with. I want to just mention the fact that he's an extraordinarily self-confident man that's not afraid to admit when he made a mistake. When he makes a mistake, he admits it. The example I can give you is that he inherited me as an assistant deputy minister, fired me, and then rehired me 6 months later. He's also terrific under pressure. He's extraordinarily calm. His equanimity is really, really extraordinary. The example I can give you is imagine landing 5 years ago in Tripoli in Libya under the regime of Muammar Gaddafi, with his photograph all over the place on big posters, and having your passport confiscated at the airport. They took away his passport and left him to wander for 2 days in Libya without a passport, only to get it back when he left, when he departed at the airport. No problem. I also have a clear vision of him being an extraordinary multitasker. The picture in my mind is seeing him working a cell phone while he was riding a camel outside of Petra. He's most remembered in the Department of Foreign Affairs for the fear that he created amongst a group of assistant deputy ministers. The way the place worked in the mid-90s when Gordon was deputy minister was there'd be an 8:30 meeting every morning, and we'd go over for half hour latest events, everybody be on the same page. So what most of the assistant deputy ministers would do is they'd get in at 7 or 7:15, 7:30. We'd have a clipping service in those days, go through all the newspapers, find out what was going on, in the European newspapers, and then come up, and we're astonished to find that they were way behind Gordon Smith, because Gordon Smith was an internet pioneer, and he used to get into the websites of Agence France Presse and Reuters, and he would know tomorrow's headlines, to the great consternation of all of the assistant deputy ministers. And along these lines, I think it's really fitting that his current preoccupation is he's the vice chairman of a global commission on internet governance, and I think it's very, very well founded. I just want to say one thing about the working style of these two gentlemen, because they have different roles after all. So the experience I've had with them was in Naples, 1994. G7 summit. Mr. Martin will remember this well, because he discovered that the Italians have a different system than the finance department in Canada. Preparing for the summit, Mr. Smith spent probably 60 hours out of 72 working all night preparing the communique. Mr. Martin took a cruise to Capri on the boat of the finance ministry's police. In any case, Gordon's work in his last 5-10 years at CFGS, to a large extent, were initiated by Mr. Martin. I remember in 2001, the first contract we received was from the finance ministry, because Mr. Martin wanted to know if the G20 finance ministers became a G20 at leaders level. All of the countries didn't have the same professional caliber of advice. So there needed to be a set of think tanks that would contribute advice and let every leader, all G20 leaders, know exactly what was going on, have access to the same caliber of advice. And the question was, at that point in time, if there was to be a T20, a Think 20, then who would be the members of that particular group? And I'm pleased to say that the T20, the Think 20, is alive and well these days, largely because in the last 4 or 5 years or so, Gordon was able to get it started, and it's now a routine part of the G20 procedures. So without further ado, let me introduce you to who I think is a great man, Gordon Smith.
I'm here under false pretenses. I thought that I was supposed to introduce former Prime Minister Paul Martin, and I could sit there and listen. And instead, I have heard a vastly exaggerated summary of my career, maybe including meetings that I don't even recall having been at. But then Barry has been one step ahead of me for about 30 years of my life, so I guess that doesn't surprise me. I want to first of all thank all of you here for coming tonight. I enormously appreciate it. Many of you I know, looking out at you, many of you I have worked with. Others look familiar. If I don't remember you, I'm sorry. But, and for those who don't know me, well, you can decide whether you ever want to come to such a performance again. But I am really pleased that you are here. But above all, I want to say how honored and flattered I am that the Right Honourable Paul Martin has agreed to participate in this event. I choose my words to participate carefully for reasons I will come to in a second. But for him, with his still busy schedule, to find the time to come out here is something that for me is just an honor that is very difficult to think that I could treasure more. He also did something else. I'm probably not supposed to say this, but anyway, what the hell. When I received the award that Oliver mentioned from the Institute for Public Administration, they proposed, first of all, that somebody else would give me the award. And I said, this award, it says in the books, is to be awarded by the Governor General personally. I want the Governor General, and I'm not going to go. There was a standoff. I see Everett Lindquist out there, and there was a total standquist between me and the Institute of Public Administration. So I said, what am I going to do? I called Mr. Martin and said, look, there's a problem here. Well, he said, that's no problem. And surprisingly, within 48 hours, the call came telling me when I was to be at Government House with my family for what was an extraordinarily moving occasion, but it made a big difference to me that this actually came from Michael Jean, Governor General at the time, who I think just did a superb job, one that all Canadians would be proud of. So I'm deeply grateful. I could go on at length about my gratitude to Mr. Martin, but I won't do that. I said that he did establish a condition for speaking tonight. He said, I'm not going to give a speech. I'm not going to write out a speech. What I want to do is to have a conversation, to have a dialogue with you. And I said, that would be absolutely fine with me. He said, but more than that, I want to have a dialogue with the audience. I want to make sure we leave enough time so that we can engage people who are interested to engage with him, with me if you're really desperate. So we will do that. So it's an unusual kind of format that we're doing. And we already have one question that we want to ask, or that Mr. Martin wants to ask, a couple of members in the audience, both who worked in the Center for Global Studies. So it's going to be a different kind of evening, and I hope you'll enjoy it. When I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's Sherpa for the G7 and eventually G8 summits, one of the things that I did was to go and meet with the Minister of Finance. In fact, I've known Mr. Martin from back into the 1970s, so we knew each other. And we got into a discussion in his office in the Department of Finance, which I found to be absolutely fascinating. And that's that the new world is all about global interdependence and how we're going to manage global interdependence. He was being quite clear that this applied obviously to the field of international economics and finance, but more than that. And I remember that conversation very well to this day, because I thought how right he is, and it corresponded very much with the kinds of things I wanted to do with the Department of Foreign Affairs. Well, along came David Strong. And David, when I was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, wanting to talk about how foreign affairs could do more to bring in more foreign students, which have many benefits they bring to the campus, finances being one of them, but not only. And David Strong had a vision. He had a vision of creating the Center for Global Studies. And I want to pay tribute tonight to David for having had faith, bringing in somebody from outside, and getting me to get the Center for Global Studies well launched. So David gets all the credit for that. Now, when we thought about what the focal point is of the discussion that we would have tonight with my good friend Barry, who actually is the one that came up with the actual title of short-termism. My wife, who's here, says, I can't believe that's a real word. Well, Barry uses a lot of words that I didn't know before I met him, but it is, in fact, a real word. I did check. But to talk about short-termism in politics, because people like Barry and I and others in this room who have worked inside the public service, who like to think we provide the best evidence-based policy advice that we can, it then goes into the political process, as it has to be. We live in democracies. And the question is, how does the political process in democracies affect the ability to produce good public policy? Is the fact that there are elections that are going to be held south of the border every 2 years, as we know here, well, we have a law that says one thing, but the reality may be slightly different. It seems to be still very much at the discretion of the Prime Minister when the Prime Minister calls the election. But this immediately made me think of the statement that Winston Churchill made, that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried. And I've always thought there's a ring of truth in that. And I'd like to begin, and I'm then going to sit down here and we can have an exchange. I guess you've got to unmute your machine, just to give you a second's forewarning. And the first question that I wanted to put to Mr. Martin is that, as far as I can see, there's no constituency for global issues which require a longer-term view. The classic case that comes to my mind, indeed that Barry and I have worked on at some length, and I believe he still is, but the classic case, of course, is climate change. And Mr. Martin, at one point, was out here with David Anderson. I think Mr. Martin was finance minister and David was environment minister. And there was a conversation with Andrew Weaver, who I saw on the list as somebody who was coming. I hope Andrew's here or he arrives. Because there was an interesting discussion of what it would take to really get government to move on climate change. So I wanted to begin with the question, what about climate change? Does short-termism, and feel free to comment on short-termism in the way I've summarized it, is that an answer for why it has taken governments so long to respond to the challenges of climate change?
Well, one of the reasons that, as Barry said, that takes me a little longer to brief than Gordon is that when I don't get briefed, I disagree with the question. I actually think that democracies, short-term as they may be, can in fact address long-term global issues, can address global issues far more than command states. And the reason for it is that, let's just use climate change as an example. If a leader or a country wants to address a long-term issue for which there is either insufficient support within the country, as there certainly was in the case of climate change, or because the costs of addressing it are simply too expensive for this generation to pick up, and therefore let's stick it on our kids. Fundamentally, a leader can either begin the debate, and it will be taken over by others in society who will build up the pressures, who will build up the arguments, who will in fact make it possible for the democratic leader to say, well, okay, I've now got to deal with this. Which does not happen in command states. Just take China. China has had, and for a long time, a huge problem with climate change, huge environmental problems, far worse in terms of the country than does, let's say, North America or Europe. And yet, they've done virtually nothing. They're only now beginning to wake to the issue that they've got to deal with. And the reason is quite simply, if you're not a democracy, you can ignore the problem for far longer than can a democracy. So my own view would be, number one, that in terms of long-term global issues, it's actually easier for a democracy to do it than for a state which operates on command. My view is as well that if a leader in a democracy wants to deal with an issue, the leader can make it the issue for his people or her people. And as a result of which these issues will start to come to the place. The reason that I think dealing with climate change has taken so long to catch hold is I don't think the debate has been put well. I remember very clearly, some of you who will go back and are as old as Gordon or Barry, which none of you are. Nobody, it's impossible to be that old. But if you were, you may remember that what happened was the first debate that took place was over the ozone level. And the ozone level eventually turned out very well. And there was a tendency among people to declare victory. And climate change had a heck of a time. In the battle between climate change and the ozone level, ozone won overwhelmingly. They dealt with it, and there was a great declaration of victory. But I think one of the things that set the debate on climate change back more than any other was after Kyoto, when all of the G7 countries agreed to their targets. At a summit meeting that you and I were both at, Bill Clinton stood up, made the big speech, and then the Americans failed to ratify. And I think that under those, what happened then is it just set the whole debate back for a very, very long period of time. I was at Rio. When Maurice Strong had basically led that meeting. It was evident at Rio that nobody was going to, that they were going to get their pictures taken and they were going to leave. And so my guess is that in terms of long-term issues, actually I think a democracy could do it better.
Thank you. I hope we'll come back to this issue, so any of you, and I don't address it. I want to jump around to a couple of issues.
You're doing something wrong.
I'm listening wrong?
You told me to turn mine on, you didn't. You see, let me just tell you what it was like. Barry talked about the briefing. That's these public servants, for God's sake. They can't brief themselves.
No, they always think first of their minister. You've got to make sure that the minister's okay. One of the lower moments, indeed, was when we were in Paris for, I guess, briefing the French when they were going to take on the summit. And it started to snow in Paris. This actually does happen, for those of you who haven't been caught in the snowstorm. And I remember, well, everybody was going to miss their flights. And this was not a junior person in the Foreign Service that I'm talking about, but somebody else who nobody in this room would know. You'll remember this, Barry, who, when Mr. or Mrs. Martin said, "But what about us? How do we leave?" This girl said, "I got to deal with my own travel first." You see, good public servants would never do that. They would always do the minister first, and if there's a prime minister there, the prime minister even in front of the minister. Anyway, enough on that. You've been talking, I mean, we're talking not only about global issues, we're talking about how issues get on the agenda and how issues get managed and decisions taken, as opposed to what you were just saying about commitments made and then nothing follows. I've been reading quite a bit over the last period about what you've been saying about First Nations and First Nations education. I guess the question that I would like to pose to you is, I mean, you've been very, very direct in what you've said. Do you think that most Canadians really appreciate what the issue is and what can be done? I mean, because it seems to me that the issues are, the overall First Nations issues are evident and stare us in the face, and our record as a country is not good. But on education, given the mushrooming population of First Nations people, it just seems to me that it's pretty obvious that we're walking towards, if not disaster, something pretty awful. But I'm not sure how many people actually see that. Now, maybe I'm missing something.
Harry Swain is here, who probably knows this issue as well as any Canadian I know, and it's rather hard for me to think, I mean, just in case he's as rude as you and Barry, then he's going to contradict me. But let me come at this a different way. It's impossible not to be aware of the issue. It's impossible not to be aware that from poverty comes more poverty, that we have underfunded education to a degree that is unconscionable. And if the question that you're asking me is, are Canadians aware? They are, but there are different levels of awareness. And I find that when you speak to Canadians about the issue, Canadians are outraged at the unfairness and what has happened. But I don't think they wake up the next morning outraged. And I think that is where the issue really lies. And there is I'm going to deal with your question a little more philosophically if I can, because I think that we can get into the issues of education, and if we would like. There's a lot of deep issues as to why we should act, but I think we should understand, each of us in this room, where in fact we are coming from on this issue. The fact is that when the European settlers first came here, the First Peoples didn't exist. In their mind, they realized that they thought they were coming to a land where nobody was. They realized that there were people who were here, but they really didn't count. They didn't basically say these are people with a different culture, I want to deal with their culture. They came and they said these were people with no culture, no traditions, no background, and therefore we've got to fill that gap. And subsequently, over time, I think people began to understand, but you know, you could not have done residential schools. No people with any degree of humanity could have done residential schools unless they felt that the people that they were dealing with had so little understanding, so little background, that they were going to have to engage in this. I mean, I think that this is really this incredibly immoral thing that occurred. We all know about it, but you've got to then ask yourself, how do people do that? And I don't think that people do that if they think that people exist. There's a very well-known First Nations educator, a Mi'kmaq from the East Coast, but who teaches at the University of Saskatchewan, called Marie Baptiste. And she's written some very interesting books, and one of her books in which she talks about what she says, I'm so glad to have Native studies now being taught in universities across the country. But she said all Native studies that are taught in these universities are taught as if Native studies is a subset of European culture. And she's right. You think about it. Native studies are not in this country taught as a culture unto themselves. They are taught as a subset of Western culture. There's a philosopher, Charles Taylor, who talks about this as simply people who were not there. And the fundamental